Pushing further and further out in search of something to see and somewhere to rest, I had sailed all the way out to Hawaii to try to find some horse racing there. What I found was a drumbeat rumble and then spikes of guitar and trumpet bound together as the credits for Hawaii 5-0 came rolling round, Steve McGarrett striding over the island like a colossus in drain pipes. My memory tripped me up and took me that one short step back to Thomas Magnum, bunched up in tight shorts over hairy thighs, or encouraging the waves to come splashing over his hairy chest. He smiled a lot and laughed like a dog, but he hardly seemed to crack any case before it opened up in front of him. I knew that because I watched 3 episodes straight through, by which time I was somewhere else entirely, and the next 30 hours blurred into a piece of my life that will forever be known as watching the detectives. I chased those people across channels and through media any which way I could. I watched and I recorded and I would flick back and fast forward, trying to catch every P.I., Mick, Seamus and Gumshoe I stumbled upon. I suppose I broke for the bathroom, but not too often, and I stopped to make some food, then carry it back. Now and then I drifted away, and I never knew if it was for a second or a minute or longer. I just went out of focus and paused, always hearing the signature tunes playing over and over again in my head. Tom Magnum remained a touch point throughout the session. He seemed to have more fun than any of the others, and when you're playing a game or daydreaming, fun seems as good a criteria as any for setting a benchmark. Still, he was locked into an 80s look that I thought might not work so well today, and as I'd noticed before, he was more or less useless as a detective. Everything happened around him or by chance. As I watched more and more and began to wade through my watching like quicksand, I knew in my head that it was all down to scriptwriters having to flat-pack character and story into a 45-minute package for an American audience. English TV was slower and more sedate, allowing an hour. Mostly, though, that just meant more meaningful looks from suspects and sleuths, or an opportunity for social comment as an aside. The plots weren't much deeper, the exposition no more dramatic, and generally the detectives weren't any smarter. They just had different quirks. From Kojak's lollipop to Columbo's Mac, there were little hangers for the actors to hang their acting chops on. So I began to see how to sort them into groups, and nationality was as good a starting place as any. Given that it was a fairly scattershot approach, my tripping took in detectives, police, as well as the amateur sleuths, and I started in the Big Apple. Kojak came up early and I had to love him. It wasn't until a week later that I began to wonder how come a Polish cop was being played by a bald Greek bloke, best known for being the mad part of the Dirty Dozen and the baddie in the James Bond film that no one remembers, but you didn't care. Telly Savalas gripped the screen and played it like a pinball machine. He was utterly ridiculous in so many respects, and yet you'd never want to cross him or have him fix his eye on you. Talking of eyes took me back to Columbo, and I remembered with a smile that he was the one that had got me into this mess. Columbo as a show was slick and smart, and I didn't like it at all. I found after watching just 20 minutes that I longed for the murderer to get away with it. Columbo was too smug. You just wanted to punch him or maybe straighten his raincoat. I kept being distracted by thinking how bad his car must smell, with the stench of that raincoat and the stale cigar smoke. At the other end of the spectrum and country came Crockett and Tubbs. They were the flip side of Magnum's 80s slacker. He had the hair, but they had the white suits and the shoes and the soundtrack, all minimal synthesizer and drumbeat echo. In my own druggy state, there were times when I almost tripped off out into nighttime Miami-Dade. Despite all that, they weren't much better detectives than Magnum. The triumph of style, as they say, trumped substance. They said a lot of things with attitude and ran fast, but there wasn't much brain work in evidence. Brainpower was the province of Jim Rockford. I hadn't heard of him before, and I was captured immediately by the theme tune. Jim was full of sass and answering back. His impersonations might have been a bit cheesy, but they showed a mind at work. He was a real detective, and he got the girls. I noticed that Magnum, for all his biceps, was remarkably chaste. So Jim's pulling power was attractive, though his trailer and general poverty didn't inspire me. After that I lost the trail for a time as I made a couple of phone calls to friends and family, and then I was back in the hunt, and I hit pay dirt with a website that spewed show after show at me, from the laid-back, streetwise savvy of Hill Street Blues through to the street gang menace of The Wire, via an identity parade with characters as diverse as Tony Monk, Eddie Shoestring, Lord Peter Wimsey, and the fast-edit frenzy of crime scene investigation across New York, Miami, and Vegas. The scenes were endless and the setups endlessly replayed, recycled and reinvented like rock and roll in its 3-chord trick. From Harry O to the Bill, I was always on the side of right, looking at wrongs. I took a turn then away from television and dipped into film. The characters had to work faster and harder, with no 20-episode run to let them fill their parts out. They had to be direct, and no one fitted the bill better than Humphrey Bogart. I never quite worked out the difference between Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, and it didn't matter much. This was all bogey. He was the ultimate tough nut, though. Again, he seemed keener to slap and shoot his way to a conclusion than think it through. He wasn't the only one to play Marlowe, I discovered. Elliot Gould made him a comic gumshoe, and Robert Mitchum growled and grunted, but the part was bogies. He had the attitude. Perhaps that was the American way. It was certainly reinforced by a character called Cannon. I caught him in a TV movie, which led me back to the small screen. He was an extraordinary man, carrying over 300 pounds and a snub-nosed revolver. In truth, he was probably closer to the real detective out there in the world. At the same time, I preferred Magnum's looks and lifestyle. It wasn't until I found Jessica Fletcher in Murder, She Wrote that I started closing in on some form of intelligence. This was lightweight stuff, though, and I was distracted more by the deft acting than the story. I flushed with British pride to see a fine English actress take a lead American role and nail it. Of course, she was basing most of her part on the quintessential Miss Marple, created by England's finest Agatha Christie. Now this was class. I was so impressed that I determined to read one of Christie's books sometime, or at least look out for the next television adaptation. Miss Marple was so completely your favourite great-aunt that you almost felt compelled to confess to her, even if you were innocent. The problem for Miss Marple was not how good she was, because she was magnificent, but which was the greatest performance. Margaret Rutherford was sensational, of course, and I marvelled at the subtlety of Julia Mackenzie, but in the end, an actress named Joan Hickson stole the show. She was awesome. Her face was lined with knowledge, and every pore seemed to contain a fact or a memory that would help her. The move from Miss Marple to Hercule Poirot was natural, and again there was some fun in deciding who had given the greatest performance. I was distracted, though, by the grating smugness of the man, and by the end of a fast-forwarded episode I was just making notes about him as that little Belgian git. The complete opposite was, possibly, the greatest of them all. Sherlock Holmes was a giant. Again, there were multiple portrayals and an extraordinary range of approaches to the character. Basil Rathbone towered above them all, probably because when I searched to find more about him, I saw him charging up and down castle stairs, wielding a sword like it was a stick. How could anyone match up to a detective who could fall back on medieval sword fighting when things got tough? Or so I thought until Jeremy Brett turned on the camera and caught me. I'd never really paid Holmes much attention, and for half a minute Brett seemed almost pantomimically over the top. Then, like the denouement unfolding, his performance started to snare me up, and after 20 minutes I was chasing his expression, trying to read the words that seemed to lodge in the lines of his face. He worried me so much, I had to push my way out of bed to have a break. I seemed to feel his suffering and the hunger of the search. I didn't know if I was getting better or getting worse, but I needed food and drink. When I returned I was calm and looked for something lighter. Starsky and Hutch were fun. Roger Moore was unutterably smooth as the saint, and Robbie Coltrane magnificent as he pushed through the suburban squalor of Glasgow's cracker. His fellow Glaswegian was Taggart, probably the hardest nut of the bunch, and a man I would definitely not mess with. Location, as I'd found right away with Hawaii Five-0, was important. Jersey was a key setting for Bergerac. Botswana was part of the stars of the #1 ladies' detective agency, and France was always a suspect in Maigret. The list went on. I paused and took stock. What had I learned?